Hello, everybody. Avid Thinker here, and this is going to be my first micro podcast on this channel. Today, we are going to be discussing the topic of free will, because I believe that this idea is fundamental to being able to understand anything about our universe and to understand anything about philosophy. Because ultimately, if our choices are meaningless, if they're predetermined and there's no truth in what we do, then there's no reason to go out and seek knowledge, to seek truth. So, before I dive into the three different views on free will that I'll be discussing in this video, I first want to define what free will is, as the listener's probably wondering if I'm going to go on and on about this topic without actually defining it. So I would define free will as the capacity of an individual to choose between multiple different courses of action in a given scenario. And the listener must take into account that the term individual here is talking about human beings. So I'm not talking about animals in this video. That's a whole different can of worms. But in this video, we're going to be focusing on, do human beings have the ability to choose? So that aside, let me get into these three different views on free will. So the first one is determinism. So this one actually discredits the notion of free will, that free will is a myth, and that all of our choices are actually predetermined by either historical events or laws of nature. So historical events, as in past events, and laws of nature, as in those laws which govern the heavenly bodies and just earthly laws, such as the law of gravity. And I believe that this interpretation of the idea of free will is actually very flawed, because the proponents of this argue against themselves in a sense. Because if you argue for determinism, you argue against human reason. Because if all of your beliefs are predetermined, then there's no way to tell what is true and what is not true, because all of our ideas are just there. They were predetermined from the beginning, and it's impossible to tell if one idea is actually better than the other or not, because they're there now. And it also undermines, the idea of determinism also undermines human purpose. If all of our actions are predetermined, then we have no purpose in this life. But I think the biggest argument against determinism is that determinism undermines moral responsibility and morality. That is, in day-to-day life and in our justice system, especially in America, we hold people accountable for actions on the basis that they could have done otherwise. So, for example, if someone were to go out and murder 3 people and then be brought to court, a determinist would say it was inevitable that he had to kill those people. Whereas most of us would say, no, what he did was wrong and he didn't have to murder those people. He could have chosen another course of action instead of doing that. And I think that's the biggest flaw in determinism, is that moral praise and moral weight lose grounding completely, that nothing is praiseworthy and nothing is to blame, because it's all just predetermined. Additionally, determinists cannot tell you what is good and what is bad. Because if everything inevitably leads up to the present moment, then what's to say what is good and what is bad? Because determinism is inherently rooted in materialism. And this makes a lot of sense, because materialism says that there's nothing outside of what we can see, what we can touch. Outside of matter and space and time, there is nothing. And this makes complete sense with determinism, because why would people be able to choose when their atoms have been set in motion in the beginning, and they will not stop going in motion? They will not stop there until their end goal. That is to say, we're all automatons. But I think that most listeners would agree with me in discrediting the idea of determinism, because rational deliberation presupposes that multiple outcomes of a situation are possible. For example, when I walk into any scenario, I'm thinking about all the different possible outcomes of my different actions. I don't view the scenario as there's only one way I can approach any conflict or any problem. No, there's multiple ways I can tackle an issue, and that our own subjective ideas of free will seem to contradict the idea of determinism from the very, very beginning. And C.S. Lewis actually has a beautiful quote on the idea of determinism in his book Miracles, published in 1947, which is that no belief is rationally inferred if it can be fully explained in terms of non-rational causes. That is to say, you can't rationally get to truth if all your ideas are non-rational, if they have a non-rational cause, or if they have a non-rational root. And I think that really exposes kind of the underlying, just the wrongs of determinism. Now, the second idea in this topic of free will is compatibilism, which posits that determinism and human choices can both coexist simultaneously. That despite the fact that all of our choices are determined, we can still act in accordance with that and kind of alongside that. Now, don't take my word for this. I would highly recommend the listener to look up things on this because I'm not fully versed in this. But I think that compatibilism is also incorrect. I think this is a flawed view of free will as well. And this is mainly because of the consequences argument. That is to say, if our actions are the direct consequences of past actions and or laws of nature, neither of which can be changed in the present moment, then our actions cannot truly be free. Humans cannot act freely because free will, ultimately, the ability to make choices, goes fundamentally against the idea that there are no choices. And I think that it's very strange to be able to marry those two beliefs in your head without changing the definition of one of them. And I would posit that freedom is shallow if you remove the element of choice, that you can't truly be free and you can't truly act freely if you are being acted on by some outside force that is forcing you to do an action. Peter Van Inwagen, on his essay titled An Essay on Free Will in 1983, he says that if determinism is true, then our acts are the consequences of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. But it is not up to us what went on before we were born. Therefore, the consequences of those things, including our present acts, are not up to us. So he would argue for a determinist viewpoint, but he clearly states that there is no such thing as marrying the idea of free will and determinism, as compatibilism tries to do. Now, the last view of free will, which is the one I would personally adhere to, would be libertarianism, which is that free will is incompatible with determinism. That every individual, myself and yourself included, would have the capacity to make choices that are not predetermined by past phenomena. And I think that this is the most logical, and it lines up with my own subjective assessment with myself and my own action. And I think that many philosophers would agree with me, and many listeners would agree with me, that in scenarios, they have the view that they have multiple different choices in a matter. No one approaches a problem saying that there's only one way to solve it, unless you don't want to solve the problem, that is. Now, libertarians such as myself would posit that an individual is ultimately the author of their actions. Now, I want to dive into the idea briefly that God and free will can simultaneously coexist. Because unlike the idea of determinism, if our physical world inevitably allows things to happen, most atheists would say that God, likewise, would be, if he is supreme and if he is sovereign over everything, would therefore have to direct everything on a given course, and that no person would be able to act against that. Now, most religious folk, I think, would, or specifically those that are theists, would agree that free will and God's sovereignty are not incompatible, but that God has created each of us with a free will, because without having free will, love is ultimately impossible, and that free will does not directly go against his sovereignty, but rather we work hand in hand with God towards an end goal that he has prescribed, even though we work in our own ways, but God works all things together for an ultimate end. Now, most arguments against libertarianism would argue that chance is ultimately the byproduct of a lack of determination. But personal authorship does exist, and even most compatibilists and most determinists would agree that in any scenario, they feel like they have the choice, and they would say, oh, well, that's an illusion. But it's abundantly clear that when we make any decision that there's multiple outcomes to any scenario, so ultimately, we each have to personally author our own actions. And Immanuel Kant, in his essay, A Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, says, freedom is the condition of the moral law, and the moral law is the condition of freedom. So he ultimately says that if we have a moral law, which history shows that most people would agree with, then we have freedom, the freedom to act according to that law or the freedom to act against that law. And that is ultimately, I think, why I believe in the idea of libertarianism. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for bearing with me through that. And I'll get back to you soon, hopefully with another topic, possibly something about the idea of God to back up some of the claims I made in this video. Please comment down below if you have any critiques of anything I said or any ideas. And that's it for today. Talk to you guys later.